For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of darkness of this world, against spiritual wickedness in high places.
Hello and welcome to a presentation on the great controversy, the battle for your choice. This is the 12th presentation in this series and is entitled Selfishness Inherently Inside. I want to remind you about the book, The Great Controversy, on which these presentations are based, and encourage you to try and get it and read it. This is just a copy or an example of the book. It's been reprinted many times. If you're really looking for this book on the internet or somewhere, you might see a different cover, different pictures. I also want to remind you that at the end of each presentation, there will be contact details about how you can get a free copy of the abridged version, the shortened version of The Great Controversy, which is entitled The Great Hope. In our previous presentation, we looked at how attempts were made to have God's law broken and altered, and saw that the fourth commandment in particular was under attack, as it undermines God's authority, his title, and his jurisdiction or domain. In this presentation, we are going to study the most expensive thing in the whole universe. What is love? Just to recap, God is love. What is the opposite of love? Sin. This will be the study of this presentation. In the very first presentation, we asked the question, is God more than love? And we answered no. God is no more and no less than love. All the attributes of God must and do flow from love. We ended by briefly looking at another attribute of love, his glory and eternal presence. Let's just quickly go over this again. The great I am, Exodus 3 verse 4 says, and God said unto Moses, I am that I am. Yes, God is who he is. By choosing to be love, God is who he is, because love can only happen by free choice, and God is love. Yahweh, Jehovah, the great I am. The Jewish forefathers would not even pronounce this name. It was so sacred. This name represented the eternal presence and instilled utter reverence in them. Why? Why this reverential fear? Yahweh, is God not love? What is the opposite of love again? Selfishness or sin. The acronym sin to me means selfishness inherently inside. The title of this presentation. Can sin exist in the presence of God? And the answer is never. They are life and death opposites. The one must destroy the other or be destroyed itself. As we will see, one is stronger than the other. Love conquers all. God is love and his glory. In Deuteronomy 4 verse 24 and Hebrews 12 verse 29, we get this thought coming through very strong. For the Lord thy God is a consuming fire. And Isaiah 33 verse 14 says, the sinners in Zion are afraid. Fearfulness hath surprised the hypocrites. Who among us shall dwell in the devouring fire? Who among us shall dwell with the everlasting burnings? The answer is given, he that walketh righteously and speaketh uprightly and shutteth his eyes from seeing evil. As we study love, we are going to study this concept that God's glory is his goodness, and it is an everlasting fire that can never go out or be put out, because God is eternal and God is love. Let's read these two quotes. To sin wherever found, our God is a consuming fire. Hebrews 12 verse 29. Also the previous verse that we read. In all who submit to his power, the Spirit of God will consume sin. Let God consume sin today. But if men cling to sin, if you choose to stay and hold on to sin, they become identified with it. It becomes part of you. You are becoming so entangled that when the glory of God, which destroys sin, it will destroy you or the person clinging to sin. At the second coming of Christ, the wicked shall be consumed with the spirit of his mouth and destroyed with the brightness of his coming. We find that in 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 8. So God is love. This is his glory. It's a consuming fire. This means that the light of the glory of God, which imparts life to the righteous, will destroy the wicked. It is the same love that does this. Love does not decide this for us. We choose. Can you see now why the battle for your choice is all about choices? It is not arbitrary. It is just what love is. Love wanting you to choose love and life. God is a consuming fire. His glory does consume. God is life, so love is life. So no love means no life and is equal to death. In Proverbs 8 verse 36 we read, "But he that sinneth against me wrongeth his own soul. All they that hate me love death." This is the choice. Are you choosing life or are you choosing to love death? Okay, read with me on the screen as we start to look into what is the most expensive thing in the universe and why it is so expensive. In Revelation 14 verse 6 to 12, it says, "And I saw another angel flying in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel." Remember, we spoke in the first presentation about the everlasting good news, the everlasting gospel, to preach unto them that dwell on the earth and to every nation and kindred and tongue and people, saying with a loud voice, "Fear God and give him glory, give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment is come. And worship him that made heaven and earth and the sea and the fountains of the water." The seal of God, once again, found right here. Who he is, his title, name, and jurisdiction. We're going to focus specifically on the third angel's message, and the third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, "If any man worship the beast and his image and receive his mark in his forehead or in his hand," that choice that we are making, that mark that we are putting in our foreheads, in the frontal lobes, "the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture in the cup of his indignation. And he shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb." Wrath. Wrath. The wrath of God. It will be poured out on some of us. Yes, some of us listening to this presentation right now. I repeat, wrath. The wrath of God, it will be poured out on some of us. God is love. Who believes this? Do you really believe this? This has been the topic of our study and the golden thread running throughout all these presentations. I hope that by now you have heard this sufficiently to believe this and realize how true and deep and eternal this statement is. So then, who wants to be like God? I'm asking you, friends, listeners at home, I'm asking you, who wants to be like God? If you want to be like God, then you need to learn to be love. For God to be love, he has to hate. For you to be love, to be like God, then you will need to learn to be love. And for you to love, you will need to learn to hate. Today it will be one of our goals to learn how to hate. This sounds paradoxical, but just stay with me. This is one of the primary goals and purposes of this presentation. There was only one thing that Jesus, yes, who was God, hated, and that was sin. Selfishness inherently inside sin. We have become way too soft on sin. Yes, today we want to learn how to hate. Yes, to actively hate sin. Sin today needs to be taught to be feared and hated. Yes, actively hated for the hateful thing it is. If we see a rape of a 3-year-old girl, which happened not too long ago, we should be made sick by it. We would be monsters if we did not hate this evil. How much more so for God? I repeat, yes, to love, we have to learn to hate sin. Today, it is my wish that you will learn to hate sin. We have in the past too often learned to hate the sinner and love the sin. Today, we will learn to hate the sin, but love the sinner, starting with ourselves. I speak today to you as the chief of sinners, but saved by grace. I'm in the process of learning to hate sin more and more, and this love God more and more. You cannot love God, but as you begin to hate sin, and as you begin to hate sin, you start to love God. Once you perfectly hate sin, you perfectly love God. Complete spiritual healing that has to happen in our minds from sin happens when we perfectly hate sin and perfectly love God. This is when even the propensity, the nature, the tendency to sin is taken away from us, and we hate sin perfectly as Jesus did. He was our perfect example. We, however, can be perfect right now where we are and start to hate sin in our sphere as God hates sin in his sphere as we grow and become sanctified. What is the most solemn message ever given to man? We just read it. The third angel's message, which we just read in Revelation 14. The third angel's message is a message of wrath. It is a message of warning against receiving the mark of the beast, and a message to avoid at all costs God's wrath. Who wants to receive the mark of the beast? Who wants to receive the wrath of God? This is not an easy message. However, it is the greatest message of love and mercy there is. God literally means good. God's character is love, and this is the true definition of love. This is the gospel, that God is love, and the gospel means good news. And as we will see in this talk, that every last single thing that God has ever done has been good and done out of love. We will thus discover that his wrath is his love. The everlasting gospel in a nutshell, but amplified 1,000 times. What is the most deadly human disease today? I'm going to divert a little bit, but I'm sure you'll agree with me that HIV and AIDS would be on that category of consideration. HIV and AIDS is one of the most devastating diseases of our country, my personal country, and of our times. Today, however, I share a disease with you that is much, much more scary, much more devastating and destructive than HIV and AIDS. HIV and AIDS does not even come close to this utterly devastating disease. It is called sin. HIV and AIDS, however, is one of the closest analogies that I could come with to try and help us understand sin. With HIV and AIDS, is one of the most expensive diseases out there. Trillions of dollars have been spent to try and understand and know where, how, why, when it happens, etc., and how to try and prevent it from ever happening again. HIV is one of the most costly diseases out there. Sin is the most costly. HIV is one of the most fearful diseases out there. Sin is the most fearful. HIV is one of the most humanly incurable diseases out there. Sin is 100% fatal. It cannot be cured. It can only be destroyed. HIV is one of the most natural diseases out there. Sin is natural to us, and I will explain what I mean later on. But hallelujah, there's a difference between HIV and sin. HIV and AIDS is only as a result of sin. And so when we take care of sin today, we take care of all its problems too. And this includes HIV and AIDS. Amen? Today, yes, today, we can have hope. Even though HIV and AIDS has been ravishing and devastating our communities. Yes, you may know a friend with HIV and AIDS. You may have a family member with HIV and AIDS. Or you yourself might even have HIV and AIDS. But today, HIV, AIDS, TB, asthma, cancer, all the physical problems become insignificant when we take care of the sin problem. Today, you can have eternal life. You can choose to have eternal life without HIV and AIDS, totally and completely healed. I bring you hope. Why must we hate sin? To answer this question, we must understand everything we can about sin. To hate sin and thus love God, we need to know what sin is and what its effects are and where it happens. We've touched on some of these aspects in the previous presentations. Right now, we're going to learn all about sin, what sin is, where it happens, and its effects. Sin, by its very nature, is there to spread and increase and perpetuate itself. It grows, it wants to increase, just like love does, but in the opposite direction. It is the nature of sin to spread and increase. I'll read this quote. Since the first sin of Adam, from generation to generation, it has spread like a contagious disease. As it attempts to spread and increase and perpetuate itself, it causes pain, suffering, and sleep, what we understand to be physical death. The Bible refers to physical death when somebody passes away as sleep. And I'm not going to talk about it, but we'll find out what real death is and what real life is, maybe in some future lecture. These are the visible and tangible effects of sin that we can see: pain, suffering, and death. Can you now begin to see why we must hate sin? It is the root cause of all other disease and the problem that causes pain and suffering. The wages, the penalty of sin is death. That's what it's going to pay you. If you stay with sin, it's just going to give you wages of pain, wages of suffering, wages of death. This is the eternal death for all unsaved sinners, the penalty from which there is no return and no second chance. This is actually the only true definition of biblical death. Okay, 3 questions. The wages of sin is death. That's what sin is going to pay you. What is the sting of death? What is the power of sin? And then, what is God's law? In 1 Corinthians 15 verse 56 we read, "The sting of death is sin, and the power of sin is the law." God's law is a transcript, a description of God's character, as we saw in the previous lectures, a description of who He is, a description of love. It is His thoughts made audible to us. It describes who or what is God. God is love. So His law is a description of love. His law is His love. His law is His love made audible to us. Who wants to be saved? In these presentations, this is what it's all about, my friends. Who wants to be saved? I'm asking myself, I'm asking you. If we answer yes, then we need to know, what are we to be saved from? What are we to be saved from? It is critical that we begin to realize that we need saving from the cause, effects, and penalty of sin. Let us begin to understand sin and start with the definition of sin. What is sin? There are many definitions out there. Sin is not trusting God. Maybe you've heard this one. People come up with these wonderful ideas, and this is true, but it's not the definition of sin. Sin is believing lies about God. This is true, but it's not the definition. Sin is separation from God. Sin is rebellion or rebelliousness. Sin is lawlessness. All of these are true. Sin is disloyalty towards God, but it is not the definition. What is sin? The only true definition. It is the privilege of every sinner to ask the teacher what sin really is, because he has to know so that he can avoid it, so that he can be saved. Give me a definition of sin. We have one in 1 John 3 verse 4. Sin is the transgression of the law. Now this is the only definition of sin in the whole Bible. 1 John 3 verse 4, this is the only definition of sin. So if this is the only definition of sin, I just want to go through these facts. Sin is transgression of the law. We first sin, we first transgress the law, and yeah, if you really want to go back, you have to go back all the way to original sin, where sin started with either Lucifer in heaven, because we're talking about the original sin, or with a sinless being like Adam and Eve. Then we see the effects. Sin leads to not trusting God. Sin leads to believing lies about God. Sin leads to separation from God. Sin leads to rebellion or rebelliousness. Sin leads to lawlessness. Sin leads to disloyalty towards God, and so on. So what is sin? Sin can only be defined in the context of law, of God's law. Romans 5 verse 13 says, "For until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imparted where there is no law. Therefore, by the deeds of the law, there shall no flesh be justified in his sight. For by the law is the knowledge of sin." You can only know what sin is when you have the law, which is love, which is a description of God's character, because he wants to protect us. He wants to tell us what sin is. You cannot know what sin is without the law. If you get this definition wrong, then you're going to redefine what the whole great controversy between good and evil is all about. If you get this wrong, then you will be led to all kinds of wrong theological conclusions. Where do we sin? I'll ask you again, anyone? We sin in our minds. It's that choice exercised. Sin is not the outward act seen. This is just the manifestation of sin that we humans can see. Sin is the choice exercised in our minds. This is for years where I had it all wrong and thought that as long as I did not steal, that I did not murder, that I did not commit adultery, etc., I had not sinned. You see, sin, transgression of the law, which happens by my choice in the mind, only leads to the outward act seen. For instance, if I see R100 or $100 bill note lying on your desk as I walk past, but the only reason that I don't take that money is I see another camera lying there and it's busy looking at the desk, then I actually have sinned. I would have taken that money except for the camera. That is why Christ came to expound the law. He said that if you look at a woman lustfully, even though you did nothing wrong, you have committed adultery. Similarly, if you hate your brother, you have murdered him. You see, this is the one reason why we can never judge, because we don't know what that person is thinking, what he is saying in his mind. As you know, sin can only happen by choice. Where do we make our choices? In our minds. Can you see the choice that I'm making? Can I see the choice that you're making? Only God can see this choice. And that is the seal when we become so embedded, so fixed in our choice, either for positive, for God, or negative, for Lucifer, for Satan. And we take either Lucifer's seal in our minds or God's seal. Only God knows this. I, as a human, and you as a human, don't know. And that's why we've got to be careful of not judging. Beautiful nature. Is everything natural always beautiful? What is natural? We've touched on this before. Most people would understand natural as the way things are supposed to happen, or run, or go, or as a state that things are to be in. It is the way it works. It would be natural for a lion to catch a buck, kill it and eat it. Here's a picture of a lion catching a zebra. It is natural. This is its nature, the way it lives, the way it eats, the way it survives. I just want to remind you though, that this is natural in the context of sin. Even for the animals to have survived, and they are not free moral agents, their natures had to change to be able to make them survive in this demonstration of sin that God has that God has permitted to show what happens in Satan's government. And what does happen? Pain, suffering, and death. The demonstration. What is the nature of the sinful human heart, and what comes naturally to it? It would be natural for a little child to throw a tantrum, to be disobedient, to fight with its siblings, and so on. Why is it natural? Our propensities. We were born. Remember, we inherited them. We inherited them all the way back to the original sin, the original problem in our forefathers, right, all the way back to Adam. It is natural for the sinful heart to act in a certain way, and this will, in essence, be what we will be looking at together in the next couple of slides and presentation. Man cannot help himself. He naturally does what comes naturally to him, and this is to sin. It is natural for man to sin. What is unnatural then? The natural man cannot do otherwise. It is unnatural for him to not sin. Did you know that God did something unnatural too? We'll talk about this in the next presentation. Yes, in our next presentation, we'll also be looking into what it would mean for you and me to be able to stop sinning, to stop having selfishness inherently inside us, and getting back into the circle of love and into life itself, back into the hedge of protection. Friends, I now, however, need to remind you that we are in a cosmic battle called the Great Controversy. And this battle is all about the battle for your choice. Right now, I want to invite you to make some choices with me, which are based on this presentation. The first choice: choose to accept that there is only one definition of sin, 1 John 3 verse 4, and that is the choice exercised in our minds to break God's law in our minds. Sin is the transgression of the law. The second choice: choose to hate sin. This is to choose life and to love God. As you choose to hate sin, you will be choosing to love God more. And as you choose to love God more, you will be choosing to hate sin more. The third choice then: choose to realize that you by nature love sin and hate God, but choose to allow God to destroy sin in you before sin destroys you. Allow this greatest of miracles to happen in your life today. Before I go, I just want to remind you about this little book entitled The Great Hope. It's an abridged version of The Great Controversy on which many of these thoughts are based. Of course, the Bible is the basis for every last single thought we would like to talk about. But The Great Hope says, a revealing look at the battle between good and evil and who wins. Thank you for listening, and until next time, God bless and goodbye.